Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Matt Holman, partner at G&T. So today we are on our third panel session, which is on sustainability. I'm going to introduce you to the agenda, and Ollie will take you through the agenda. In normal, I'll give you an update on the forum. Ollie will introduce our panelists. Then going to a Q&A, which will also have some poll questions in the usual format. I'll introduce our next session and conclude and close. So, Ollie, do you want to introduce our panelists first?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and a very good morning to everybody listening in this morning. You, the audience, asked for the sustainability panel to be brought forward in our webinar series on mass timber commercial offices. So we listened, and here we all are. The importance of getting to net carbon zero and improving the health and well-being of our commercial office buildings has never been more incredibly important. And today we will discuss and debate the role that mass timber commercial office buildings can, is, and will play in contributing to these targets. And we all have a responsibility in this for the benefit of present and future generations. Our six panelists today are diverse in their knowledge, experience, and understanding of sustainability. We don't want to waste any time in getting underway. Anything we don't get covered within the hour today, we will endeavour to pick up in our summary report issued within the next week. So our panelists today are as follows. G&T's very own Sustainability Environment Director, Richard Francis. Richard has relevant degrees from Harvard, Brown University, and the University of Michigan, and has 20 years of experience across various industries, including clean vehicles and fuels, renewable energy, and the built environment. He is a trusted strategic advisor who has helped industry and government leaders develop and implement cost-effective, performance-based sustainability solutions. For the last 10 years, he has focused primarily on emerging sustainability issues in the construction sector and the property sectors. He is regarded as an industry thought leader who is helping to accelerate the next generation of green and healthy buildings. Some of his current roles include Head of Strategic Partnerships for the World Green Building Council, Special Projects Partner at UK Green Building Council, Chair of the UK Green Building Council offices and retail labs. And some of his clients and current projects include G&T Smart Buildings Knowledge Programme, British Land Healthy Building Pilot Projects for offices and retail, Lend-Lease Sustainability Consultant for HQ and New Developments, Goldman Sachs Sustainability Audits and Rent Reviews, and the University College London Estates Department BREEAM and Carbon Advisory. Our next panellist is Alan Fogarty, who heads up Cundall's Sustainability Group in the UK that specialises in low energy and sustainable building design. Alan Fogarty is a partner at Cundall and heads up their specialist environmental building physics group. He's a chartered building services engineer who has specialised in passive building design and low carbon systems. He is chair of the UK's MHCLG 2020 Part L non-domestic working group, looking at proposals for revising building regulations in order to meet challenging carbon reduction standards. Alan led the implementation of the WELL building standard for Cundall's London office fit-out, the first certified WELL project in Europe, and offers health and wellbeing consultancy to clients on multiple projects. He's leading on the implementation of the new design for performance on a number of commercial projects, which optimises energy performance in use against design targets using the digital twin. Alan is a registered BREEAM assessor, BREEAM AP, and SAA assessor. Next up, we welcome Anna Dennell, Sustainability Director at Vasakronan. Anna is Head of Sustainability at Vasakronan, one of Sweden's largest property companies. She has overall responsibility for the company's sustainability strategy and has been part of transforming the Swedish property industry, where Vasakronan is now considered the industry leader, also playing a key role in founding a green building council in Sweden, introducing green leases to the Swedish market, and issuing the world's first corporate green bond in November 2013. Anna also holds positions as members of the advisory board for Swedish Smart Grid, run by the Swedish government, and is a member of the advisory board for Wood in Construction, run by the Nordic Council of Ministers. In 2019, she got awarded Sweden's Best Sustainability Director, and 4 of the last 5 years, Anna has also every year been appointed one of Sweden's most powerful environmentalists. Next, we welcome Lorna Walker, co-founder of Modomo and a UK GBC trustee. Lorna is co-founder, chief operating officer and head of ESG at Modomo. Modomo is an innovative, affordable housing specialist tackling the housing crisis with thriving, meanwhile, communities on underused across Europe using modular construction. Lorna cares deeply about social justice, diversity, and transforming the sustainability of our built environment. Lorna is a trustee of the UK Green Building Council. She continues to work towards a more diverse industry and is the founder of Peer 20, a cross-industry organisation inspiring each other to use their skills to help make the world a better place. Our next panellist needs very little introduction, as many of you know him already. Simon Surgis, Managing Partner of Targeting Zero LLP. Simon Surgis focus on carbon reduction policy and strategy for the built environment. He has written official policy on embodied and whole life carbon, including the RICS's whole life carbon professional statement, and with Cundall, the Greater London Authority's new London Plan carbon requirements. He is an advisor to BEIS, UK GBC, EU Commission, the Building Council for Offices, and the Reba Sterling Prize. And Simon also directly advises clients such as British Film, Schroders, and Historic England. And last, but absolutely by no means least, the BRE is represented today by Dr. Ed Suttie, Director of Strategic Advisory at BRE. Ed is Director of Strategic Advisory at the BRE. He leads a team delivering research and consultancy programs on sustainability, circular economy, timber, health and wellbeing, and material sustainability for industry, UK government, and the European Commission. Ed has worked with the timber industry for 25 years on innovative products, resource efficiency, optimizing supply chain, and service life prediction. He provided durability input on what has been what was at the time the world's tallest CLT residential building, the Stadthaus Murray Grove, that paved the way for mass timber in the UK. Ed was part of the team that delivered the timber procurement policy for the ODA at the London 2012 Games. The topic of sustainability surely must be at the top of everybody's agenda. So it just leaves us to say a huge thank you to our 6 panellists for taking time to be here today. And Matt, back over to you.
Great, thanks, Ollie. I mean, what a panel, a fantastic panel. Now on to the main event. Today we'll debate and discuss with our expert panel why mass timber is often seen as a sustainable option, try and discover the truth behind this opinion and how other countries are using timber to achieve their sustainability goals. First things first though, we know many of you have seen the latest documentary by David Attenborough on the BBC a few weeks ago on the extinction crisis. We wanted to take this opportunity to address the concerns that some of you may be having to dispel fears around the type of timber we're talking about in this forum. The timber used in mass timber production is sourced from sustainable European forestry, a vastly different type of forestry from deforestation happening in the Amazon rainforest. To further explain this, we'd like to show you a quick introductory film from the TRAE before we kick off with the questions from our panel. So hopefully this will get everyone on the same level.
Are you also fed up? Fed up with being told that everything is going to hell? What with CO2, the greenhouse effect, flooding, drought, hunger, exhaustion of natural resources, mountains of rubbish, and the pure hell of toxic pollution? Well, don't worry, because there is a solution. Wood. Yes, trees and wood products are the way forward, because wood is the world's most environmentally friendly raw material. Get this. Trees and forests are a source of raw material that grow every year, and forests are much prettier than coal mines and oil drilling platforms. But you may ask, isn't it wrong to cut down trees? No. Luckily, cutting down trees is absolutely fine, for almost all forests in Europe are managed with the purpose of producing wood for manufacture, and when we cut down trees, new ones are planted in their place. Furthermore, European forest areas are expanding, increasing about 5,000 square kilometers each year. Wood products are also healthier for the climate because trees take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in their trunks, then later in wood products. So, we are reducing the greenhouse effect every time we use wood in houses, bridges, furniture and cars. And when you dispose of wood products, the story still isn't quite over. Burn them! For there's energy stored in the wood, and by doing so, you release only as much CO2 as the tree consumed when it grew, thus replacing the use of coal, oil and gas, preventing CO2 emissions and resulting in no waste. Which is why wood is the world's most environmentally friendly raw material, a resource that both grows and produces clean energy instead of waste. Which is more than you can say about metal, plastic, concrete, coal, oil and gas now, isn't it? So use wood, for wood is good. In fact, it's nature's stroke of pure genius.
Great. Well, hopefully everyone enjoyed that one. So over to our panelists now. We're going to ask some questions. So question 1, I'm going to direct towards Anna and Simon, and it's going to start very much at the beginning and ask what is the sustainability credentials of mass timber at both material and building level, and is it better than other materials? I don't know who wants to take that first, Anna or Simon.
Anna, go.
Okay, thanks. Yes, as you could hear in the film, wood is capturing CO2. For each ton of timber that you're using in a building, you will store 1 ton of CO2. So in terms of climate change, I would say wood is the most sustainable material you could use. But I think what is typically not being discussed so much is the fact that wood is a renewable source compared to concrete and steel, which is coming from non-renewable resources. And another thing that I think is important to bring up is the fact that timber is such a light material, which will reduce the transportation need to the construction site, which will also reduce the emission during the construction phase of the building. And in terms of sustainability credentials on site or in the building, I think the most important topic to bring up is the health and well-being aspects of timber, because timber is a material that will store humidity and give it back to the environment when it's most needed during the winter, when the air is much drier. And therefore, most people that spend time inside a timber building will feel better off than compared to other buildings. And thirdly, I would like to bring up the economical perspective, which is typically not often so much discussed when we are talking about sustainability. But to make something sustainable, it needs to be sustainable from an environmental perspective, from a social perspective regarding humans, and also from a financial or economical perspective. And what we can see so far in all our timber projects, we can see that we lease them quicker than other projects. We have one office building currently being constructed in Uppsala, a city in Sweden, right now, which was fully leased 2 years before it was supposed to be completed. And we've never experienced anything like that before in our other projects. And another part of the financial benefits, since we are doing a lot of green bonds and green funding for our projects, building in timber is a good way to attract attention from financial institutions. So for this Uppsala project, we got funding from the European Investment Bank and the Nordic Investment Bank, because they want to fund projects that have less environmental impact, and therefore we get a very good funding deal for this project. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I'd echo a lot of what Anna said. I think on the lightness thing, I think the other benefit that comes out of a lighter structure, of course, is that you need less of it, particularly in the foundation. So you get a sort of additional benefits. I think, though, there is still the design of it, particularly obviously with CLT flooring and so on. It is still evolving, and I think the ability to optimize and the use of timber, in other words, minimize the amount you use, is still evolving, I would say. I think the other thing about it is, if it's used correctly, it's a very long-lasting material. It's also flexible and adaptable. So if, for example, your building needs to adapt in the future, to cut a hole in it, to put a staircase in or something, is obviously easier than with concrete, particularly if it's post-tension concrete. So it has those benefits. It's also speedy construction. I think, to put up a concrete frame involving pouring and transport of heavy materials is clearly a worse solution, and laying the reinforcing and so on. Whereas a CLT structure is something that goes up relatively quickly, given that it's essentially prefabricated off site. There are a couple of issues there. I think soundproofing is one issue which you have to be aware of. And that often means that you have to put either a screed or a cementitious board. So you need to factor that into your carbon calculations. The other point I would make is that when you design a CLT structure, it's worth thinking holistically about it. And is CLT the right material for every component of that structure? It may well be that some of the vertical structures better off being something else like steel. So to optimize your overall carbon footprint, you need to think holistically about the whole structure.
That's great. Great answer. Thank you very much, both of you. Okay, question 2 then. We're seeing 2 topics dominate sustainability discussions in the last year: net zero carbon and health and well-being. Taking these one at a time, how does using mass timber help companies achieve these goals? Can I bring Alan into that fold and ask that question?
Well, if you're looking at the net zero carbon specifically, part of that definition is looking at the embodied carbon. And as we've been saying, wood has a very low embodied carbon. So from that perspective, it's tremendously beneficial. What I would say though is when we're looking at net zero, we really have to look at all aspects and looking at the life cycle in relation to cost as well. And we're certainly finding on projects that looking at timber CLT solutions is potentially more expensive by as much as 30% in relation to the structure. So the question I would ask on these things is, if you took that financial resource and you invested in different materials or different control systems on the project, would you get a better overall carbon reduction? I don't have the answer to that, but it's certainly a thought process that needs to be looked at for all aspects of design. And the other thing I'd say is that if you take something like concrete, it does have benefits in relation to its passive cooling capability. And while it has very high levels of embodied carbon, as the grid decarbonizes, then it will come down as well. And we're looking at some projects where a very stable concrete solution, it has very stable thermal properties. And when you couple it with a heat pump, then you potentially have a very low carbon operational solution as well. So really, I'm just saying that you need to look at all things, not jump at one particular solution. It may be a hybrid version that will be the right solution for your project. Great.
Simon, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think that the key point about knowing whether your project is, or whether you're achieving net zero, is you obviously have to do the math, as they might say in America. So you need to do assessments, and I think probably the most useful guidance to use, even though it may not be strictly within the zone you're working in, is the GLA guidance that both Alan and I were co-authors of, or his team was co-authors of with me. And so the reason I mention that is it gives a really good scope for doing a whole life carbon assessment, which will help you understand the impact that that timber has, not just in terms of construction, but over its entire life. So although the GLA policy SI2 is directed at London referable schemes, it is being already absorbed by other authorities as a sort of form of guidance. So you have to do the analysis to understand the scope of it and what you're achieving. I think the other thing is just to understand, as I think I sort of said earlier, that you need to understand the timber in the context of the whole. And as Alan sort of alluded to, that it's not just the embodied performance, it's the relationship to operational performance. And if you can optimize all of those and think holistically about all that, you will get the optimum. And I think the other point I would make is that the great thing about mass timber is that it's possible to achieve significant savings in embodied carbon without major changes to the way you're thinking of design. It is part of a suite of options. The one problem we have, of course, in this country is we don't make much CLT at all. We import, I think, 80% of our timber products, and certainly we import, I think, virtually all of our CLT, probably from a lot of it from Sweden and also other countries, Denmark and so on. So I think we need to make sure we build up a industry in this country.
Thank you. Anna, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, yes, please. Could I just make a quick comment on the net zero concept and life cycle analysis? Of course, it's very important to apply a life cycle analysis when you try to calculate the overall environmental impact of a building. But I would like to make a reflection on the emissions, because to build a building will really you will emit a lot of carbon emissions, and then you try to compensate it with a lower energy consumption, or maybe putting solar panel on your roof or something. And of course, you need to focus on designing a very energy efficient building, but that can never compensate for allowing yourself to emit more during the construction phase. Because what you do when you do this analysis is you compare 1-to-1 in a very long lifespan. And nobody would do that if it would regard pounds or kronas or euros, because then you know that €1 now is much more worth than €1 in 50 years. And also, I think we need to think about the energy system going forward. It would probably be, or it needs to be less pollutant than it is now. So you should not fool yourself by allowing you to use bad materials now just because you think it will give you a more energy efficient building going forward.
I think so. Richard, did you want to
and one more thing. Designing an energy efficient building is not taking away any CO2 from the atmosphere. So you're trying to reduce emissions now with less emissions going forward, but you're not trying to reduce them by actually taking away carbon emissions from the atmosphere, which is actually what trees growing in the forest are doing.
Thank you. Rich, did you want to come in on the health and well-being page?
I would, Matt. Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. Before I do, I think it's important to think about net zero carbon and health and well-being, not as separate topics, but as completely joined. And the reason for that is the last time we were involved in low carbon and zero carbon buildings at G&T was about 15 years ago, where we knew that the more you tried to get to net zero, the more there was a negative impact on the quality of air inside the building. And in fact, that was my initial interest in healthy buildings in the first place. The position we take at G&T stems out of our work with the World Green Building Council, where we think it's important to connect green and healthy. And that is something that wood does in a way that other materials don't necessarily do. And Anna alluded to the fact that there are sort of lots of ways that you can measure this. And again, we come back to the World Green Building Council, where you measure sort of the impacts on the building itself, the impacts on people, and the measurable outcomes. And we haven't got time for a long discussion on this, but Anna's right. There are physical impacts in the building which promote health in terms of humidity, a connection to nature, biophilia. That's absolutely for sure. We know that, the mediation of humidity levels and temperature. We also know, and I think this is the more important part, that passively, and that's critically, you just put it up and it goes to work straight away, it has an impact on people's psychological well-being. And this is true whether it's children, adults, or elderly people. We know that it makes people calmer, it makes them feel better, it gives them a sense of being looked after. And that is an important thing, as we've always focused on the physical part of buildings and health, but the mental part is incredibly important, and it has a strong relationship to wood. We also know that you can measure these changes. So we don't do this in the workplace, but when studies have been conducted, you measure stress levels or heartbeat, or even the sort of the way people feel mentally, which you can do with sensors. You put them in an environment in which there's lots of wood, and you get the right kind of outcomes. 3 words around this. I think passive, which is once I mentioned already. Natural, which will be increasingly the word going forward. This is what we're all looking for at a time now. And I think post-pandemic, or as we work through the pandemic, so you're hearing lots and lots more about natural-based solutions, of which wood is obviously a great one. And the other part of this is intuitive, and I think this is critical as we come back to work and we think about joining all the dots. A lot of times, sustainability or health and well-being is sort of behind the scenes or in the ceiling and mechanical. We know this, and this has been the focus around air quality. And I think actually one of the things that wood does, I call it sort of front of house sustainability. You come in, you see it, you know straight away, no explanation needed. You know without asking that the building is sustainable. And I think critically going forward, lining up the sustainability, being sort of up front and center with people coming through the building and conveying those right kind of messages is something that wood does particularly well.
Thanks, Rich. That's brilliant. Thank you. So, Ollie, should we do our first poll question of the morning?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's go to the poll. Everybody, you should see the question flash up now. Do you think the health benefits of mass timber will accelerate the transition to net zero? And the answers are yes, no, or don't know. So one of those 3, please. Do you think the health benefits of mass timber will accelerate the transition to net zero? Just whilst you're answering those, we're having some really good comments coming through, Matt, on the actual the Q&A.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw the one on the from Nick Clark, actually, who raised the point about the lightweight also enables developers to use parcels of land that were otherwise considered unsuitable due to load bearing capacity or subterranean issues, and therefore, it helps in that regard as well. So that's a very valid point, very good point.
Definitely. And we've had another question come through from Tom Crawley at GP, so hopefully we'll try and pick that up later. So we'll just wait for the answers to come back. Alan, actually straight back in. Okay, so in terms of, do you think the health benefits of mass timber will accelerate the transition to net zero? A whopping 85% of people said yes, 7% said no, and 8% said don't know. So that's quite a powerful piece of data we've got back there.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, so question 3 then. In terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and whole building certifications such as LEED, BREEAM, WELL, etc., how does mass timber fit into this? Can I bring Ed into this one?
Yes, sure. Good morning, everybody. In terms of, and many of the conversations have already occurred actually, UN Sustainable Development Goals, an increasing vocabulary that people are using to attach to projects, buildings and activities. Clearly, very significant impact around climate action, direct, immediate, now activity around climate action as we take material out of forests and build it into our buildings as custodians of this incredibly unique material that stores carbon. I'd also like to flag up, and we mentioned David Attenborough, so Goal 15 is about life on land. So forests, while they're growing, provide incredible resources as habitat, as recreational facilities, certainly in the UK, and for tourism, and a vast array of ecosystem services as well. Again, things you would struggle to attach to any other form of building material. When we look at whole building assessment methodology, so BREEAM, LEED, etc., material credits are a smaller component of the whole picture because obviously it's looking around whole building operation and so on. I would say though that certainly where things like Green Guide credits are involved, where you compare comparable components of buildings, where you're looking particularly at the materials used, timber components always come out with a better rating. So again, that becomes part of the kind of tech behind the immediately visible sustainability that Richard was describing. And also, certainly when we look at the European forest resource, we have exemplary responsible sourcing through FSC and through PEFC, Sustainable Chain of Custody supply chains. And then finally, the point around WELL. WELL has been really interesting in sort of disrupting the market and focusing our attention more on the indoor environment and occupants and well-being. Again, Richard has eloquently sort of elaborated for wood. We've done our own research. We found in every case that there is an inherent wood preference within us as human beings, as part of nature. So we just gravitate more to wood, to other materials. Also in our research, we're building the evidence around the physiological and psychological connection and positive impacts that wood can have as a material. And this is beside the points that mentioned, I think Anna mentioned, the hygrothermal properties of materials, the way it can modulate humidity and temperature in a building, just passively. It's quite extraordinary. So I would say wood features pretty well across these standards. It's got more to do in the sense that I think some of these assessment methodologies need to recognise more of these qualities as the evidence comes through.
Alan, did you want to add anything to that, Alan?
Well, I completely agree with what Ed just said. He's covered the answer very nicely. But what I would say is not so much wood, but trees. And we're looking at trees on projects where they're providing shading to buildings. They are potentially providing a modification to the external environment so that you're getting cooler temperatures for naturally ventilated buildings, particularly schools, so zero carbon schools. And the other tremendous benefit is that you're then providing a biophilic response to the occupants within the building because they're looking at these beautiful trees growing outside, as well as providing shading in summer. So I think the way we think about how we put all these things together, not wood just as being a material, but trees being something that would be fully integrated within projects is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. So, just to bring you in now, one of the perceived benefits of timber is its life cycle. It uses renewable energy to grow, stores carbon during its lifespan, and if treated correctly, lends itself to reuse or at the very least zero waste. Can you just talk us through the whole life sustainable benefits of timber, just to give everyone the full picture?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think probably the first thing to state here is actually almost everything that we've talked about so far in terms of the the benefits of timber, that feeds into the whole life point. So all of the great things that we've talked about, and there's been some sort of really good summaries of that so far. So I think that's in and of itself, there's a lot of really positive benefits of timber. So I think perhaps the key point, though, to think about when looking at the whole life point is actually what happens at the end of life, and what about the reuse of that timber. And so that's where that becomes really important. And on that question around some of the certifications and that kind of thing, if you look at BRE and carbon accounting, they don't let you assume that that timber can be used forever. And actually, if you look at that, it is still a relatively novel concept, and we don't have that much experience of that, that real end of life processes. So that's quite limited. So, so I think we do need to be quite careful about how we do that. So I think there's a few things though that we can look at, and there are a few design points that actually can ensure that there's a much higher likelihood that you can reuse it. We've touched on a couple of them, but things like having the standardized panel sizes, acoustics, for example, is something where actually, if you're using types of materials that mean it will be more difficult to reuse, proper waterproofing of it. So actually, so there are ways that we can make sure that we are ensuring it can be reused. And maybe just say, so for us as a business, so at Modomo, what we're trying to do is we are trying to create meanwhile residential communities. And we're doing that using modular construction. But so what we're doing is using land to unlock that for housing for a period of time, so say 10 to 15 years. And then at the end of that period, we can give it back to the landowner for permanent development, but we can then lift those and take them and put them somewhere else. So the reuse is incredibly important to us. Like, it's critical to our business model that we need to be able to do that. And I think one of the things that we've learned in the process that we've gone through is it's just that design right at the start. So actually, yes, it's great to be using timber and for its design whilst it's in its first use, but actually having the foresight as to what it might be used for in the future is really important. So I think it's perhaps a design thing. We need to make sure that we're doing that.
That's really interesting. Okay, so question for Anna and Ed then. In terms of supply chain, manufacture and application, what are the things to watch out for, so to ensure the best sustainability credentials? So, Anna, do you want to take that first?
Oh, yes, please. Well, the first thing, of course, is to make sure that the timber is coming from sustainable forestry. And there are, of course, a few certifications that you can use. But you could also look up, since there are not much domestic timber in the UK currently, my advice would be that you look at the country where the timber is coming from. And at least here in Sweden and in Finland, there is a national regulation. For each tree you are cutting down, you need to plant, as a forest owner, 2 more trees. So the woods in Sweden and in Finland are actually increasing a lot because of that. And it's also forbidden. There are quite large forests that are already kind of preserved that you cannot use for forestry industry purposes. So the wood or the timber that is coming from the Nordic countries, I would say, even if it's not FSC or PEFC certified, it is in terms of whether it's sustainable or not, it would be okay to use. But another thing is, of course, to think about the transportation and try to source your timber from a location that is not so far away from your construction site, if possible. And of course, try to use transportation modes that are less pollutant than, for instance, trucks, if it's possible, because timber, since it's so light, it's possible to use railway, and also you can ship it, of course. I don't know.
Ed, did you want to add anything to that, Ed?
Just very, very quickly, in order to get other questions in, I think I would I'd really emphasize the point about, we're talking about comparing materials here, but really we should be, comparing the building. So when we worked with KLH on the Stadthaus in 2008, the product was the building, and it was all about the skills that came with that incredible material that came together to produce a really high-performing building. So yes, there are many, many contractors now in the UK. They're very well versed and skilled in the deployment of CLT. So yes, I would just put that sort of skills bit on the table.
Okay. Lorna, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think one of the other things to think about there is also the ease with which timber can be used with MMC methods of manufacturing, and actually, it lends itself very well to that, and all the benefits that comes with that in terms of efficiency and quality, and it can be very easily pre-engineered. So I think that's just another factor to consider, and obviously in terms of what we're doing, that's a key factor for us.
Simon.
Yeah, I think the other one kind of slightly not particularly common feature of this is the actual procurement, and just sort of adding to Lorna's thing about what happens at the end of life. I know that BAM Construction, I know in Netherlands, I think it was, leased a timber structure for 20 years, I think it was going to be. So the idea that you don't actually have to pay the capital cost, but you pay a leasing cost, the constraint was that it had to be in sensible lengths that could be reused, rather than some, it had to be 7.5 meters or something, rather than 6.83 or something. So the idea that there are other procurement models is not impossible with something like a timber product. And I know people have already done this with light fittings and air conditioning, where you lease it rather than buy it. So I think that may be interesting, particularly because it has a future potential life.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. So, Ollie, do you want to do our second poll question, Ollie, and get that one done?
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is probably the million-dollar question, I suppose, for many of our developers. Do you believe the sustainability benefits of mass timber outweigh the challenges faced with viability and cost? And again, it's a yes, no, or don't know answer, please. So if you could pick one of those and let us know your thoughts, and I'll read out the results in a second. We're getting lots of questions coming through on the Q&A by developers, James Pellet and John Curran and Simon Corbett. We will do our best to answer those today. If we don't, they will be picked up in our summary report.
I think in the live questions towards the end, there's a good one that's coming from Steve Toon, actually, that I'll quite like to raise. So I'll raise that towards the end if we get time.
And the answers are back in. Do you believe the sustainability benefits of mass timber outweigh the challenges faced with viability and cost? Again, a whopping 77% said yes, 9% said no, 14% said don't know. So thank you for voting on that, everyone.
Great. Right, let's get into some quicker fire questions now. So Richard, does using mass timber have any limitations over conventional materials? What about cost, program, supply availability, etc.?
Sure. Well, good. Thank you, Matt. Well, we've addressed some of the costs already in the discussion. If I can pick up John Curran's question in the chat, I'll try and address that right now, because it's about value. So in terms of cost, just very quickly, we know that there might be a premium cost for the material, but we know that the construction cost is very competitive due to a reduced construction time, reduced overheads, less on-site labor, opportunities to produce off-site, and all the savings that come with that. And G&T has done a study with Rambo, Scott Browning, and JLL, which may have been mentioned in previous ones of these, where we looked at the cost of these things, and the cost of timber is very competitive with other materials. That's the cost side. The value side, which is what John was asking about in his question, I think is critical, because we know, when we're talking about net zero carbon or health and well-being, we know that those are the two issues that are going to dominate, at least they're going to at least impact on value going forward. And when I say that, I'm thinking of what do occupiers or what do occupants want? And we know from a very, very good study by the Harvard Business Review that timber accomplishes a lot of these things straight away. So it gives the connection to nature. It affects the air quality. It gives the opportunity for people to have a much more natural environment. That is what people are going to be looking for increasingly in buildings. We also know that there are a couple of sort of hidden costs associated with this, such as the price of carbon allowances. So we don't always factor that in, but we know that the GLA has £60 per ton allowance price on carbon, which you ought to factor into your buildings with timber. One other thing, and it relates to sort of the transparency or the upfrontness about wood. We know that transparency and sustainability is the model going forward. And so we've talked about certification so far, but increasingly we all know from net zero or even health and well-being, we're going to have to tell people how we got where we got to, whether it's zero carbon or health and well-being. And one of the things that wood does particularly well, it does it on the face of it, it communicates value straight away. I think that was John's question, or at least part of John's question, which I tried. How do we communicate to people that wood is better and more valuable and perhaps worth a little bit of a premium? The answer is, I think people sort of know this already. It's just sort of demonstrating to them the benefits of wood and communicating, not using terms like biophilia, which is a connection to nature, but actually demonstrating to people in terms that we know already that wood is good for you and that a house that's made of wood will provide you with a better experience.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
So, question we've asked in our insurance panel and indeed on our fire control panel is, and we're going to ask it again here, is what lessons can we learn from other countries like international? So Lorna, can you pick up that question?
Yeah, of course. So, and just for context, so we operate, we're operating in the UK and also in Europe as well. So Germany, Netherlands have been a particular focus, and we've also started exploring in North America. And I think, I mean, just looking at that, Europe is fully embracing mass timber, and the regulatory environment. So from the government, but also I'd say private sector, universities, they're all very much behind it, and so there's a real movement to go for it. So I think that's one thing, is actually this kind of buy-in and this understanding of the benefits that it has, and so everybody moves towards that. And if you look at North America, they've gone crazy for mass timber as an industry recently. They've also done it really quickly, which is really interesting. So they have they've built the capacity to manufacture the same amount as Europe just in the last 12 months, which is incredible. So there's perhaps some things that they've still got to learn in terms of design and that kind of thing, a bit further behind on that, but actually, it can be done. So I think it's actually probably about just having that buy-in from the different levels, of government. So you've got a regulatory framework that really supports it, evidence-backed regulatory framework, to really make it work, and actually then that understanding from the other stakeholders that you've got. And your occupiers also really buying into that. And if you look at in North America, all the the big tech companies, they all want their campuses to be built using timber. So I think there's a lot to learn.
Great. Thanks very much, Lorna. Okay, last of my sort of scripted questions, if you like. Can policy help accelerate adoption of mass timber? Can I ask Ed that question, if they could pick that one up?
I mean, you can, absolutely, Matt, and the answer is yes. Lorna's already alluded to some of that, and actually part of the stimulus in North America was because the USDA offered millions of pounds as an incentive to initiate that. So, policy, and particularly around carbon policy and government intervention, is really, really important. In the UK, we are a bit different. Hackney Council still have their Wood First local policy, which enabled the original CLT domestic building that I mentioned. There are wood encouragement programs now being deployed by various county councils across the UK. So things are starting to move in terms of local development. I think possibly the most interesting thing for me is that, as Lorna said, things are moving at even greater pace across Europe. So France in 2022, it will be in law in new buildings that 50% of that new building must be bio-based materials. So they're sort of enacting a very positive and progressive environmental policy from central government, which will massively influence the future of their built environment. The Netherlands, they have a decree for about 6 or 7 years now, which is about combating resource depletion and focusing on more natural materials for their development. Certainly across Switzerland, you have to provide a full building carbon footprint and talk about what is sequestered in your building before you get planning permission. So yeah, the movement is definitely there. Back to the last question, I think we can learn a lot from how that's been enabled in different sectors, but absolutely policy will be pivotal in getting a step change.
Thank you very much. Well, guys, that was fantastic. We've actually got time for our questions. So I've got a good one from Steve Toon, a friend from AKT. He's raised a good question. I think will be quite an interesting one to ask you. Can the panel please give their view on the RICS life cycle assessment, and particularly the stage D, and whether we should be measuring sequestered CO2 in assessments or not? He highlights that there is a significant swing, positive and negative, in the ICE figures, and then sustainability consultants have different views of the assessment. So I certainly want to pick that one up first. It's coming up with a pretty good question. Any takers? Looking round. Oh, Simon, go for it.
Well, seeing as I wrote the RICS thing, I better kind of stand up. I think the first point is that you do measure sequestered carbon. It's in module A, which is the product stage. So you do measure it. You're asked to identify it separately so that it's transparent and you can see what the figure is. So and I think I saw there was a question from Simon Corby on a sort of similar topic. But so you do get the benefit of the value of sequestration in module A1 to A3, which is the product stage. In terms of stage D, the point about stage D is it's really to do with the circular economy, and it's encouraging people to think to the future and put a value to that. And I think that's the difficult bit, is that why should people be interested in the potential reuse and recycling of products at the point of design, because is there any commercial benefit? And I suppose the answer is it's a difficult one to make, but I think if the value of a building is partly to do with its future potential capabilities, and then I think the answer is yes, it will have value. It'll take time. I mean, I don't know whether Anna's got any views on that in terms of the way she's dealt with things, whether in her experience, the sort of module D, the circular aspects, have a value, and whether that can be seen as having a future value.
Anna, did you want to pick up on that?
Well, definitely. I think you should take it into account. And I'm not familiar with the RICS LCA assessment method, so
it's on the European standard BSEN 15978.
Okay, so it's the same. So it's not a special one. Okay. And in that case, I'm not sure I agree with you, Simon, that the sequestration is accounted in A1 to 3. Typically, we exclude it and then we count for it separately. But nevertheless, I think you should at least be aware of it. And I think it's especially, you should make designers, architects and other designers related to the building design process aware of it, because you have a very large responsibility to design buildings that are almost eternal, because if you design a building in a very good way and it will last for a very long time, you will actually store and capture that CO2 for a very long time.
Thanks, Anna. I think we've got time for just one more question. I mean, this has come from Tom Crawley, and he says, appreciating that we need to take into account the timber in the context of the whole, but are there recognised or published benchmarks on the difference in embodied carbon between CLT, hybrid CLT frames versus more traditional frame construction in the UK? I don't know who's best placed to answer that. Anyone? Or is that one we need to come back on? Looks like we need to come back on it. Okay, let's come back on it.
Do you really need to do an analysis?
Well, I think
it's quite easy in mathematics, I would assume.
I think it's, yeah, I think it's more the benchmark piece really, whether there's that information available. Go on, Ed.
Matt, sorry, just very briefly, I'm aware certainly, but this is, 10, 15 years ago, of comparative studies looking at timber frame or modular homes compared to traditional brick and block and traditional concrete and things like that, certainly in a housing context. And that was all part of the kind of initial momentum, I think, around the uptake of timber from 7% in 2000 up to 30% in 2010. But yeah, it's a little bit sort of outdated probably now.
Okay. Right, so the final question I've got for all of you really is, what is the future? So what is the future of mass timber and commercial real estate? Little brief answers from all of you, if you may.
Should I go first? I think it's absolutely important and critical to what we're doing, and I see it as a huge part of the future. And I would just want to add that I think to help us get there, we need to be really collaborative as an industry to help us do that. There's still a lot of challenges around it, and some of the questions that have come through, I think we can really help by being collaborative, by being open, and it's great to kind of hear the examples where people are sharing, and I think sharing that best practice will help us to get there quicker.
Great, thank you. Simon?
I think there's a couple of things. I think we need to recognise that to get to zero carbon by 2050 and the steps along the way, we're going to have to do radical things. We can't just tinker around the edges. And I think certainly mass timber is part of that. But I think we have to, and I think also interestingly enough, I think the world of investment's moving in that direction, that the need, and I'm sure the audience will know better than I about the world of investment, but certainly my impression is that climatic risk is becoming a significant issue to do with investment. And I know that, for example, Dutch money's moved into LNG because of their sustainability policies. The Bank of England is stress testing financial institutions for climatic risk and so on. So I think that there is a significant shift, and I think future-proofing asset value, mass timber is a fundamental part of that.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Anna, did you want to come in?
Well, maybe it's a little provocative to say in in this gathering, but I think what we really need to do is question ourselves: how much do we really need to build, at least in this part of the world? Because there is a need for buildings, but maybe in other regions where there is a lack of good hospitals, schools, and affordable housing. So, but when you come to the conclusion that this square meter actually is needed, not just from a financial perspective, because we can earn money by developing it, I think timber is definitely the way going forward. There is nothing else that will be economical feasible. Concrete, if you add, and steel, if you add the cost for carbon capture and storage of the emissions related to those construction materials will simply be too costly.
Alan, did you want to come in?
Yep. My view is that everything should be evidence-based. So we should avoid knee-jerk reactions. We've seen that in the past, and it's been quite negative. So we should make sure that we are looking at things clearly, looking at the problem clearly, so you come up with the right solution. And I also believe that designing for deconstruction and reconstruction is essential, regardless of what material we're talking about. And I think BIM has a role there, because we can get a lot of information into BIM about the materials, so that in 20, 30 years' time, when a building is being deconstructed, you know exactly what's gone into it, you know its specification, and you can do whatever tests you need to make sure the materials are still valid. So you've locked in the carbon, and you've locked in the cost, so you can reuse both effectively.
Right. Ed, did you want to provide a word on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the evidence point is really important for us. We're deepening the evidence around the health and well-being impacts of wood and interiors in construction, which has cropped up quite a bit. I think the really interesting thing for me for mass timber is and the buildings it can provide is it can provide perhaps a new framework which will provide a different valuation for real estate. We will think about how we value real estate assets differently, and that's going to be critical, I think, for our return to the office that we are all anticipating and how that is managed in the future. And those health qualities, the inspiration, the safety are going to be paramount.
Great, thanks, Ed. Richard.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. And just to pick up on a couple of points, Alan mentioned ingredients. I think this is kind of an interesting way to think about buildings going forward. So the way I tend to think about them, or the way we at G&T think about them, is the way we think about other products. So usually there's an ingredient list, and there's a nutrition table, and then there's a sort of sustainability credentials around other products in the world. In buildings, we've always focused on the sustainability credentials, but we know from the health and well-being that we're increasingly interested in ingredients and what they do to you. That's kind of interesting. So that's the sort of thing to play with. And I think that's only going to increase because wood is one of those things that hits all of those categories well. But to be a little bit more sort of commercial minded about it, you know, it's also the case that, you know, lots of other things in the last year, particularly, have been driving this, health and well-being for sure, and all the events that are going on in the world, but also the investment community getting much more serious about net zero carbon and asking the questions. If you look at the growth, for example, of the TCFD and the number of organizations that are getting into this and asking questions and looking at net zero carbon and transparency and reporting in a serious way, that is only going to drive what is already an increasing interest in wood and growth of wood. It's growing, you know, now it's estimated to grow, you know, by double or triple in the next 20 years by most estimates. So things can happen in this, and you know, we know the dangers of predictions, but there's lots of evidence that wood will play a greater part.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
Right, everyone. We just about come to the end, so I need to wrap up. That's been a fantastic session. Thank you all very much for your time. So we had our insurance panel, we've had our fire testing and building control panel, we've just had our sustainability panel. So next up is best practice during construction, and we've got Andrew Shepherd from Mid-Group, David Smith from Lendlease, and we've got Graham Barter from Mace joining us for that session. So that will look at topics such as water ingress and fire during construction and those sort of things. So that's fantastic. Yeah, we've had lots of questions during this panel, which we thank you for. We will answer them and answered in our. We've got our report for the fire testing and building control session to come through shortly, and then we'll obviously report for this one as well. But like I say, we've had lots of questions. Thank you all so much for your input, and don't forget give us the questions for the next panel on the best practice during construction, in order for us to get the session set up for you on the 3rd of November. Okay, that's it. Thanks everyone. Thank you all panelists for your time. That's fantastic. Thank you.